I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. The mesmerizing hum of cicadas over the course of a pandemic summer forms the unsettling backdrop to Erica McKeen's new horror-inflected novel. It's called Cicada Summer, and it follows a trio of characters, Husha, Nellie, and Arthur, who are living in a lakeside cabin in the summer of 2020. The three of them discover a book of stories, specifically horror stories written by Husha's recently deceased mother. And as they read these stories, things start to get really weird. The stories begin to bleed into their daily life and become a bit too real. Erica McKeen is here to talk about Cicada Summer and how she wrote a novel that kept me up at night and genuinely made me a little bit more afraid than I'm used to when reading a book. She joined me from the CBC studios in Vancouver. Hey, Erica, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm not too bad myself, thank you. I want to talk first about the structure of Cicada Summer because there's this sort of book within a book thing that's going on. We have these three main characters, Husha, her grandfather Arthur, and then Husha's lover Nellie, who are actually reading a book together while spending the summer in Arthur's cabin. And we as readers are able to read the stories that the characters are reading. So I'm wondering how you came up with this idea for stories embedded within another story.
Well, this is a question that I've thought about myself a lot because it's a complicated one for me. First and foremost, when I was thinking of creating this book, I had a group of short stories that were thematically linked that I wanted to put together. But it didn't feel like enough for me. And that isn't to say that short story collections in and of themselves aren't enough in some way. But I think because the stories are so focused on the horrific, the delirious in many ways, like they're mostly dark stories. I felt like I had more to say about them. And that's when I started having the idea of putting a frame narrative around them, having these three characters to actually read the stories along with us and provide some more context to provide like an opposite or opposing perspective of comfort, of healing. So we have something else going on there than just the horrible. And I also was pulling a little bit from Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient, which they don't tell or read stories in quite the same way, the characters in that book, but they're also, it exists in the aftershock of World War II, that novel, and it's a group of kind of mismatched characters who get together and tell each other stories from their past. So I was drawing a lot on that structure as well.
There's actually a Michael Ondaatje quote as part of this novel. There's these themes of like novels and stories reflecting real life. There's ideas about mirrors. There's ideas about reflections. And there's a quote that you include that says, "A novel is a mirror walking down a road." And I was wondering why that was something that you wanted to include in this book.
Yeah, that's a quote that I've always loved. And it's probably because I've been obsessed with circularity. And it's like sometimes a trope of horror fiction as well is like the beginning reflecting the end. You know, is it a ghost of the past that you're seeing, or is it a ghost of things to come? So this idea was always kind of haunting and creepy to me. And you see it come up in the book again and again, even with the story The Surfacing, which is about the fish eyeballs. Like seeing forward and backwards is just a concept that I find very eerie and in a way almost comforting too, because if you can see forward and backwards, then there's kind of like a destiny or fate to your life, which I don't actually believe in reality. But when I'm writing stories, it's like it feels really cozy, but also scary at the same time.
In the introduction, you start off by writing, "If you find this book, you are Husha." And it makes you feel very embodied, I find, within the character of Husha throughout reading. What did you mean to accomplish by starting the book in that manner?
This is a surrealist text. That's how I was thinking about it when I wrote it. And especially afterwards, I was like, that's what I was kind of doing there with the surrealism. So surrealism, a lot of the time, tries to disrupt reality as we know it or as we imagine it. You know, this objective, mundane, everyday reality happening around us. And it, there's the dreams and the unconscious and this inner deep life kind of exploding up into that mundane reality. And when I was writing like both the structure of the book and also especially that introductory paragraph telling the reader that they are Hasha, I thought, what if we could disrupt like the material reality of the book itself, like the physical book that we imagine is pages bound up in this cover. And that's all it is, which I don't really believe because I'm just a person that loves literature and has always, like, to some degree, lived in books and stories. I thought, what if the book that you hold in your hand is the book Cicada Summer that I have written, but what if it's also the book that Hasha is finding in some, like, paradoxical, impossible way, right? Like when Hasha does find the book in her mother's house after her mother has passed, it says Hasha finds this book. And when I was writing it, I imagined that she was actually finding this physical book. And she sits down and opens a table of contents that is identical to the table of contents that you, the reader, have already seen at the beginning. So I just imagined it as a way of like exploding kind of this idea we have about the physical book and how it can seep out into your own life, whether you want it to or not. Like there is a slipping that happens when you enter a good book. Like your brain actually seeps into like a deeper level of consciousness or reality than the one that you're sitting inside, whether it's your couch or wherever you are that you're reading that text.
There's these relationships between Husha and her sort of ex-lover Nellie, and the relationship between Husha and her grandfather Arthur that feel very lived in. One of the scenes that affected me the most was like Husha bathing her grandfather, who's elderly and he has trouble getting in and out of the tub. How do you craft those kinds of situations in literature?
Like a lot of this novel and those scenes in particular were taken from times that I spent 6 months taking care of my grandmother sometime before she died. So I dedicate this novel to her as well as my other grandmother who's still living. And I didn't actually have to wash my grandmother, which is nice. She actually had someone who came in and did that. But I would sort of see in my periphery the whole thing happening. And there is something icky about it. It's the body. Like maybe this is why I like to write about body horror stuff. Like bodies are gross. We're scared of bodies. We're scared of that ickiness. We like to have our bodies perfectly in order and in line. But I think there's something really beautiful about that. Like I'm kind of fascinated by ugliness too and the ickiness. Like I think in order to have a full perspective on life, we have to be able to look these things in the face. Like they happen. Like when you grow older, someone has to bathe you, right? And it's such an intimate experience, maybe even with its ickiness. Like maybe it wouldn't be as intimate without the ickiness. So part of that, when I'm writing those, comes from reality for me and past experiences that I've had. And then on the other hand, you know, this intimate relationship that Hasha has with Nellie at the time was more wish fulfillment, working through my own queerness as I wrote this novel. So it's half and half, once again, like taking from the real world and also taking from the imagined as I craft the story.
Mm-hmm. Care is definitely a huge theme in this novel. And there's this idea that care can be tied to love and connection, but it's also sometimes something that people do out of guilt or out of habit or out of expectation. I'm wondering, can you maybe talk more about how you've worked through that tension in this novel and possibly in your own life?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that, because care was one of the central themes and things I was thinking about while I wrote Cicada Summer. I think while I was growing up, the versions of care that I saw around me, it was like on this binary opposites pretty much. There was the more like capitalistic care where someone's hired to do something and there's not a lot of emotional connection there and they're paid with money. You know, it's very much just an exchange of labor for cash. And then on the other hand, I saw this altruistic version of care, which is often very gendered as well, right? All the women in my life, or many of the women in my life, I should say, were giving themselves and caring for others, whether it was children or the elderly or, you know, and I wanted to consolidate those two sides of the spectrum because both felt wrong to me. And this is why I repeat this phrase in the book that Nellie says, is that she doesn't believe in altruism. That this idea that you can care for someone without some kind of benefit to you, I think is completely incorrect. Like it's always, maybe it makes you feel better. Maybe it makes you feel important. Maybe it makes you feel powerful in some kind of way. So I thought, what if we could consolidate those two things? What if, you know, receiving money, for example, for caring for somebody didn't mean that you didn't actually care for them. If you don't investigate your own motivations for why you're caring for somebody, then it can get kind of nasty. It can get kind of, I don't know. Yeah, it can turn negative, I think, very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely that can be a breeding ground for resentment or sort of falling into habit, I think, around doing care work and not even understanding why anymore. One of the things that stuck with me the most from this novel is a story that Arthur tells, like, verbally to Nellie and Husha. He's talking about this woman who, as a child, saw her brother drown, and she continues going back to this same spot in the river where the younger brother drowned for years and years and years, including as an adult. And there's this sort of parable of, like, at this point, her brother has been dead for so long that she doesn't even really remember much about him anymore, besides that she goes to the river. I'm wondering, for you as the author, like, what were you exploring with that almost parable-like story?
I think this is something that I'm still working through myself as well, and it's very complicated. Like, I have a family with a history of OCD, so and the idea of compulsion or habit or doing something ritualistically is always very forward and forefront on my mind. I was also interested when I was writing that story of this woman. She loses touch with those original emotions of her brother drowning, and yet she still goes back to kind of commemorate him or remember him in the river. And then it turns into not even the river, it's just a bathtub. Like, she has to plunge her feet into cold water in order to feel anything. And I think that's the crux of it, is that maybe she can't let go of the fact, or she can't come to terms with the fact that that love for her brother is gone. That grief for her brother is gone. Like, the human brain, I feel like, is so flimsy as time goes by. Like, we lose our memories of the people that we loved, and sometimes we lose those feelings that came with it. And what a horrible thing, right? I think the line in the book is something like how terrible that the most awful thing that had happened to her became or becomes commonplace. It just becomes something that happened. So I think her compulsion or her ritual is a way to try to reconnect herself to what happened to her, even though she doesn't feel it anymore. Mm-hmm.
Husha's mother has just died a couple months prior to the events of this novel, and it's sort of ambiguous how she died. She overdosed on some sort of pill, but it's not totally clear whether that was an accident or whether it was on purpose. And Nellie, who obviously is very close to Husha but isn't a family member, is asking Husha, tell me about your mom. And there's this way that Husha gets overwhelmed and all of a sudden feels like she can't remember anything. How do you think that grief and loss specifically alters the memory?
That's a hard one. I think possibly when, like, a real grief happens, someone that you love dies, and especially dies suddenly. I mean, to Husha, her mother has, on the one hand, died suddenly, and on the other hand, not at all, because she speaks about how things like this have happened. Like, not, her mother obviously hasn't died multiple times in her life, but her mother has gone to the hospital for similar reasons before, and she almost has a sense of relief when she finally hears that her mother has passed, because she's probably been worrying about it for a long time. But I think when a hurt that huge occurs, there might be something inside of us that protects us from that feeling, that blocks it out of our minds. I think it takes a real effort to look things in the face. And by things, I mean, like, the person you have lost and the feelings that you're experiencing.
Grieving, I feel, was depicted as this kind of, like, solitary and isolating process that alienates people in this book from the people around them a little bit. You're, in the case of Husha and her grandfather, for instance, they're grieving the same person, but they had different relationships with that person. And there's this, like, moment where Arthur wants to carry this box of Husha's mom's stuff up from the basement and won't let her look at it. Like, there's all of these kinds of separations between people. Why do you think grieving can be such an alienating process when it's something that we all face, and, like, in basically no situation is it ever something that you're actually facing alone? There's always someone else who cared about that person who's now gone.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Maybe because it's such a personal experience. And like, as a writer, I know it's really, really hard to express things. Like, you can feel things and you can kind of understand the emotion that you're experiencing. But to put it into words, if we're talking about, experiencing grief collectively through language, maybe through storytelling, it feels like kind of an impossible task. And this is what the characters Husha and Arthur, I think, run into together. They both have these perspectives of the mother, right? Like, Arthur is the mother's father, he's the grandfather, and Husha is the daughter. And there's a moment where they talk about how they would love to have the other's memories because there's such different experiences being the father of someone who's struggling with mental illness, or else being the daughter of someone who's struggling with mental illness. But they also hopefully somehow come to terms with the fact, like, they'll never be able to take those memories from each other. They'll never be able to take those emotions from each other. So as much as I want to say, like, yes, we can all come together in our grief, and maybe that's possible. Maybe it's possible more on like the level of physicality, like maybe through touch, we can come together with our grief. But I feel like there's such a failing of language. And as a writer, I feel that so deeply. It's like you try to put something down and it just doesn't come across in the way that you wanted it to. Part of the grief that I was writing about when I was writing this book was just like the grief of disconnect, a lack of understanding with other people. There's a moment where Arthur's in the bathtub and Husha is kind of watching over him, standing by the sink. And he says, I know you expected more than this. I know you wanted more from your mother, but you'll never know her. And like loving someone is not the same as knowing them. So maybe there's some kind of understanding that we need to come to, that I need to come to in my own life, that you can still love people without understanding them maybe at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you brought up that quote because it was literally on my page of things that I wanted to ask you about. Like, that was something that was really, I think, a thing that I know intuitively, and then it's a different thing to read in a book and be like, oh, darn, knowing someone and loving them are not the same thing. But I thought that I was different. And if I looked through all of the archives and documents and boxes left by my dead family members, then I would know the secret. No, I think it is this kind of, I don't want to say universal because certainly, as we've both been saying, like, grief is such an individual experience and every grief is different. And that's like what they tell you if you go to grief therapy. But I do think that a lot of people go through this process of wanting to go through the archives of a person who is gone. This is a very big question and not maybe fair to ask you because I don't know that anyone knows the answer to this. But how do you like reckon with that? Like, do you feel like in your own life you're in a place where that uncertainty and the fact that there's things we don't know is something you're comfortable with?
I would say no. Maybe someday I'll get there. But this is probably why I'm still writing. So in a sense, maybe I'll always want this feeling to be there, this inadequateness and this sense of mystery as well, right? There's something there that we can't see. There's something there that we'll never see. It can be exciting on the one hand, right? It's hopeful. There's more to discover. But as you said, there's like a limpness to it. So how I deal with it is I try to write things that feel like wholeness. On the one hand, stories can have like a sense of fullness to them, of wholeness. And then I also, like very paradoxically, try to write things that are inconclusive, that reflect this world that we're talking about. Like this frame narrative of Husha and Ellie and Arthur is pretty inconclusive. There isn't a lot of character development that happens as we would expect in a novel. We love things to change. We love to see like a big resolution at the end, and that doesn't happen here. So I think to answer your question, how I deal with that is just to continue writing things that feel good in one sense and that feel really kind of empty and limp in others to help me deal with these feelings.
I want to ask about genre a little bit. What about horror in particular is a genre that really captivates you as a writer?
Well, I think mostly, and maybe I mentioned this a bit before, is that it really wakes me up. So when I feel that feeling of inadequateness, of limpness in my life, of finding no resolution, basically a feeling of numbness, kind of like as if I've stuck my own feet into the cold river, right? And like they've come out numb. Horror is something that can wake me up again and feel alive. I mean, I also love it because you can put monsters in it, and monsters are just like forces of evil, of course, but they're forces of action. And when you get those feelings of limpness, of maybe kind of like malaise, depression, whatever it may be, like a monster is something that can force you upright in your chair. But then also, like you said, I just love horror's ability to have these inconclusive endings. You know, the horror trope, the classic thing is like you get to the end of the story and the monster has been defeated or the demon has been eradicated, and then something happens to make you question all of that. You know, a flash of red in the eyes, maybe the demon is still there. And that's very scary. Once again, it wakes your body up. It makes you feel unsettled. But there's also an aspect of hopefulness to this. Like the story can continue on beyond the page. It doesn't all have to be finished. Maybe that goes back to my experiences of grief and my dissatisfaction with the way that people are pulled from this life. Like the story can go on. The world might be bigger than the one that we see in front of us. There could be, you know, something bubbling under the surface.
I want to talk a bit about some of the more hopeful stuff then in this book, because there is this tinge of like, yes, there's this unsettlement and grief is not resolved. The mystery of Husha's mother is not resolved. The nature of this book of short stories is not resolved. But then at the end of the novel, we also have this beautiful reflection on the idea of romantic love, you know, Husha's journey to loving Nellie, another woman, and the difference of that love to her previous experiences with men. You mentioned far earlier in our conversation, you know, it's interesting, our conversation is taking a bit of a circular nature as we've been talking about circularity.
Perfect.
But you mentioned before that you were working through your own queerness in writing Cicada Summer. I'm wondering what that process was like for you and how that journey maybe shaped the way that you wrote about love in this novel.
Yeah, so like I said before, part of the reason I wanted to have this frame narrative around the stories and not just have the stories themselves was I wanted to have that sense of hope and that softness. And the stories themselves maybe have like a bit of queering going on. Like I'm thinking of the Swamp Woman story with this strange relationship between the character wife Emily and this swamp woman that like comes out of the ceiling of the bathroom. So there's maybe some hints of those things going on in the stories themselves, but most of this comes out in the frame narrative, in the relationship between Husha and Nellie. And for me at the time, this was like full fantasy, full wish fulfillment. I was kind of, or probably still am to some degree, a repressed person. As a bisexual person, it's very, very easy to hide that part of yourself. You can just be with men and everybody accepts you and there's no issue there, right? But it's still there. It's still inside of you. And because I was already writing, this was, of course, the space that it started to emerge for me. I didn't have an understanding of my own queerness until I started writing this text. And I was like, what is this all about? And at the time, I was actually, like, I was writing this during the pandemic, like summer and fall of 2020. And I had just moved to Vancouver and I was living with a bunch of roommates and they had all been past English majors and we started a book club. And of course, because you're stuck together in a house during the pandemic, what are you going to do but read and talk about it? And we were reading Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, which is actually doing the opposite thing that I do here, where she's saying, you know, lesbian relationships are not always a dream. They're not always a utopia. They can actually be abusive and terrible. But for me at the time, I needed to write something that was kind of a utopia, a space of absolute acceptance. And this comes across in the relationship between Husha and Nellie. Like Nellie kind of disappeared on Husha at the beginning of the pandemic, but Husha basically welcomes her with open arms and says, you know, come on in, stay as long as you need to stay, and then go again when you need to go. But also with Arthur, who's just sitting there in his chair, not saying anything. And if he does say anything, it's like, how many onions do we need to buy from the grocery store now that Nellie is here? Not in like an upset way, but just like, you know, practically, do we need to buy more groceries now? So no questioning there, just full, total acceptance. And that was like a dream world for me when I was writing the book.
Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You just heard my conversation with Erica McKeen. We were talking about her novel, Cicada Summer. This episode was produced by Liv Pasquarelli. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. There's a big team behind Bookends, and it includes our amazing radio techs and the wider CBC Books team. I want to thank them for the work they do to make this show happen every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.